This is Kevin Butcher, and this is Rooted, the podcast. So glad to be with you this afternoon. Before we get into what we're going to talk about today, I want to just encourage you to listen to, I think every podcast we've done has been well worth listening to. But I would encourage you to listen to especially the last two podcasts, the first of which was an interview with my wife, myself, and our three daughters about family life, not just about trying to be emotionally healthy as a pastor's family, but just as a family. And it's a process, and it's a healing process. And so no matter whether you grew up, whatever kind of home you grew up in, however healthy or unhealthy it was, you'll find some healing, I think, in this podcast. And I think you'll find healing for your present situation, whether you are a parent, a grandparent, or a child that's old enough to listen to this podcast. I think you'll find some healing there. And then the next podcast was with our newest staff member, a pastor that has come alongside, we've hired to come alongside myself and our team, named William Mack, Pastor William Mack. And he's just, listen to the podcast. He's just a great man, a great guy. And I think you'll glean a lot about our passion together for pastors, for their healing, for their having connections that will sustain them in the long haul, and for our passion together about seeing the Church of Jesus Christ be all that it can be. But today we want to talk about healing from trauma and how relationships impact that healing. And before you too quickly say, well, of course, everybody's been wounded, but I haven't been traumatized, let me say, and I've vetted this definition more than once with various therapists, that trauma is simply a deep wound that keeps us stuck if left unhealed at some point in our life. So if we experienced a deep wound at the age of 8 and it never got healed, there'll be a piece of us that we've left behind. And so can you imagine, for those who have been deeply traumatized over a long period of time, how much of a half-life they're living, how much inside them is shut down, how much they don't have access to of the personhood that God created them to be, let alone just the pain that they're living in, and then all the relationships that are impacted by that unhealed wound, that trauma. So I think really this includes all of us. And I want to talk I'm going to talk about how relationships help heal that trauma, and then try to connect it with what this means to us as followers of Jesus and what this means to us in the Church of Jesus Christ. But also throwing in a little bit of brain science. I've been reading lately a couple of books that I'll tell you about in just a moment that are helping us understand that what Jesus created in forming the church of his church, the Church of Jesus Christ, as being an incredibly connected, relational, centered on love, the healing power of love community. Let's just say that what we're finding out in neurobiological science about the brain, it all fits together. It all makes sense. The healing is not just emotional in terms of what we feel, and it's not just spiritual in terms of how we relate to ourselves and God and others. It literally is healing in our brains. That's what neurobiology is telling us. And in fact, both of the books that I'm referencing today, outside of the Bible, of course, are books that have been written by scientists, by two psychiatrists, actually. The first is called The Body Keeps the Score: Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. It's a New York Times bestseller. It's pretty current. 2014, I think, is when it came out. And I was fascinated by this book. It's a very readable book. Yes, there's some scientific language and jargon, and he quotes a lot of studies and the results of these studies on the healing of trauma, but it's a very readable book. And I just want to read a couple of paragraphs from what this doctor has to say as one of the leading scientists on how we can heal from trauma, what he has to say about that in terms of relationships. This is what he says. Bessel van der Kolk says in his book, The Body Keeps the Score. He says, traumatized human beings recover in the context of relationships. Relationships with family, with loved ones, AA meetings, veterans organizations, religious communities, or professional therapists. The role of those relationships is to provide physical and emotional safety, including safety from feeling shamed, admonished, judged, I would also say in the context of church, preached at, and to bolster the courage to tolerate, face, and process the reality of what has happened to them in their traumatized lives. As we have seen, van der Kolk says, much of the wiring of our brain circuits is devoted to being in tune with others. It's literally called attunement. Recovery from trauma involves reconnecting with our fellow human beings. This is why trauma that has occurred within relationships is generally more difficult to treat than trauma resulting from traffic accidents or natural disasters. He goes on to say the reason it's more difficult to heal trauma that's occurred in the context of relationship is because the very people that were intended to keep us safe are the ones that hurt us, as opposed to a tornado coming through and destroying our home or tearing apart our car or even hurting one of our loved ones. When the very thing that's intended to keep us safe from trauma or heal us from trauma provides the trauma, in other words, that's a whole different healing process that takes even more work in terms of relational connection. There's the whole idea of working through the fact that now we're going to try to trust someone else to not be one of those relationships that hurts us, like maybe some of our original relationships with mom and dad and a family system that was dysfunctional or whatever. Then he goes on to say, to heal in terms of relationship. And by the way, what does that tell you about church and why some people don't want to come to church? First of all, they sense a lot of being judged. They sense a lot of being preached at. They don't feel safe to be their true selves, displaying their wounds, saying, hey, I don't want to be here today, but this is where I am today. Am I allowed to be who I am and where I am today in terms of my woundedness? Can I be safe? And then, of course, to be able to open up to other relationships in the body of Christ, to new relationships, for the healing to occur, given the fact that they've been hurt by relationships that at least implicitly promised to not hurt them, to keep them safe. It's a tall order. It says a lot about the call on the body of Christ to be this kind of healing community, especially when so many have been wounded in other churches with people that promise to keep them safe. In any case, van der Kolk goes on to say, you have to find someone you can trust enough to accompany you, someone who can safely hold your feelings and help you listen to the painful messages from your emotional brain, your right brain or your limbic brain. You need a guide who is not afraid of your terror and who can contain your darkest rage, someone who can safeguard the wholeness of you. Don't you love that phrase? Someone who can, or maybe, shall we say, a community of someone's. More than one, sometimes 2, 3, 4. I know in my life, I have a community of intimate relationships, not a dozen or 50, but a few that I trust, and then more outside that context that I trust. Not quite as much, but I trust with some of what van der Kolk is talking about. So there's layers of healing community that we really need to find our healing. People who can, let me say it again, contain our darkest rage, someone who can safeguard the wholeness of you, the wholeness of you, who you are in all of your complexity as you're trying to heal, while you explore the fragmented experiences that you had to keep secret from yourself for so long. Because so often the way we survive trauma is we just bury it. We live in denial about it. But then it begins to emerge, impacting our own health, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and then it begins to impact our relationships with others as well. And so we can't We can't keep it secret any longer. He goes on to say most traumatized individuals need an anchor and a great deal of coaching to do this work. Now, he doesn't use many spiritual terms here. But if you're a follower of Jesus, can you feel yourself saying, that's what church is supposed to be? A place where brothers and sisters can promise safety, obviously not perfect safety because we're human, but a reasonable, safe place where the wholeness of a human being, their joys and their sorrows, their giftings and their deep wounds, can be held in a sacred way and given opportunity in those relationships to heal. So one of the things I'm going to ask you to think about is, where have you been hurt? Where do you still carry wound? How is that shutting you down? And what are the relational contexts? And again, this guy, he may be a Christian guy, but he's writing from a medical perspective about brain science, about how we heal from trauma. He's saying, medically speaking, you can't heal without attunement, without being connected to others who are tuned into you, your wound, and able to walk with you in your healing process. We're going to talk more in a moment about how that process actually occurs. But for now, where are you wounded, and where are you in community where people hold the wholeness of you, to use van der Kolk's phrase? They hold it sacredly as you walk together into deeper emotional, physical, spiritual healing. And then you might ask yourself the question, how do you, to use now Henry Nouwen's term, we're all, if we're in the process of healing, we also can become a healer. So to the extent that we're being healed, we can reach out to others with a degree of safety and understanding and be able to say, we want to be a wounded healer to you. You've been a part of our relational context. Let us be a part of your healing, safe relational context. Where are you providing healing in your journey with other wounded human beings? Do you tend to preach at them when they share their wounds? Do you tend to give them cliche answers, Bible verses that you're quoting maybe as a well-meaning human being, but it basically diminishes or disrespects where that person is in terms of their wound? Do you tend to think more about how their wound is impacting you in negative ways, and so you want them to get healed more quickly so you don't have to feel their pain? Or are you able to be present to them with whatever you have to give of your safety, allowing them, in the context of your relationship with them, to feel your love and to experience the long-term healing process? So, van der Kolk has said, you cannot heal without relationships that are willing to come close to you, help keep you safe while you process. That's the church. That's the church. It's intended to be the church. Now, the second book I want to refer to real quickly is Dr. Curt Thompson and his first book called The Anatomy of the Soul. The Anatomy of the Soul. Subtitle, Surprising Connections Between Neuroscience and Spiritual Practices That Can Transform Your Life and Relationships. Dr. Thompson's second book called The Soul of Shame is one of my all-time favorite reads. So on point about the enemy's main tactic to keep us locked down is shame. And this first book kind of sets up the second book because it talks about the neurobiology of healing from anything that has wounded us in life. And it talks about the brain science that backs up biblical practices and the biblical call to walk with Jesus in community that does that healing. One of the most profound things that I've learned from this book, and it just backs up what I have inadvertently, I kind of stumbled into this in my own journey, been teaching for years. I've written about it in both of my first two books, which implies that I might write a third, and I really don't know if that's going to happen at all. But he talks about the experience and the value of, get this, feeling felt. And he describes this process of feeling felt. He's taking what van der Kolk has said about relationship, he's taking it to the next level. If you're in a safe context, how do you then begin to practice? How do you begin to offer healing to another human being? He's saying, well, first, you help them know the experience of feeling felt. And he talks about this young woman who was she came in to see him as a psychiatrist, and she was so disconnected from her feelings. She was so shut down. She had some behavior patterns and some relational issues that, again, the pain was leaking. And so she came to say, can you help me, Dr. Thompson? And so he started to probe what was going on beneath the surface. And he would say to her, when he'd ask her how she was feeling, she couldn't even tell him. That's how buried her feelings were. But then he started to probe just the facts of her background. And as you might imagine, without going into detail here, the conflict that she tried to ignore that her parents had over the years, her great fear of her parents getting divorced, just the psychological distress year after year after year as a child that she didn't know what to do with, and no one was around to really tune into her. Parents were too distracted by their own pain. So she had learned to shut down even being able to feel or note that she was feeling. And this is what Thompson says, that at a certain point, she began to cry. And then he says, as I remarked on her story and what he was observing in her, she began to change viscerally, because our bodies will start to display what we're feeling. We can sometimes, this is a whole nother podcast, but we can sometimes begin to identify feelings by first noticing where if our chest is tight, or our fists are clenched, or where we might be shaking and we didn't even know it, where the feelings are coming out in our bodies. Well, he was observing these kinds of behavior patterns as our physical reactions while he was counseling her. And he said, while he was observing the changes in her emotional state by observing her body, he says, I too felt a heaviness in my chest. Now, are you getting this? He was feeling with her. He says, tears came to my eyes as well. He said, I not only sensed what she sensed, I sensed her sensing my sensing what she felt. Those are Thompson's words. I not only felt her, but I sensed her feeling that I was feeling her emotionally. She was having the experience of what another trauma scientist has called, Dan Siegel is his name, has described as feeling felt. Her response to my observations and to my feeling, what she was feeling, was a visible relaxation in her body posture and facial expression. So as she started to sense his eyes tearing up in response to her tears, as she started to sense and feel, because our brains are powerful enough that many times without words, you can feel what another person is feeling with you and for you. She started displaying physical characteristics of relaxing, of letting go of tension, letting go of anxiety, letting go of fear. Why? Because in the context of relationships, healing was already starting to occur simply because she was feeling felt. Now I want to take you back to another podcast, something I know I've taught on the Rooted podcast. Some of you have read Choose and Choose Again, or if you've read Free, you've heard me write about this. It's 1 Peter 3:8. It's where Peter says, in the context of the early church, what is the first step to becoming one with another human being? Presumably, like now, another wounded human being in the context of the body of Christ. What is step number one? And Peter says in 1 Peter 3:8, he says you start by feeling with that other human being. By simply being present to the point that you're not trying to change their ideology, you're not trying to counter their narrative with your own narrative, you're not trying to change their viewpoints or give advice. You simply are allowing your heart to begin to feel with them. Peter says there that begins to connect you with them in a way that pulls you together. He didn't use these words, but implying in a healing way. Thompson goes on in the next chapter to talk about how in that moment of feeling with another human being, listen, when we're traumatized, certain parts of our brain begin to shut down and they begin to be wired in a way that causes us to be re-traumatized over and over and over again, because that's the way our brains have learned to process life and experience after the experience of trauma. By feeling with another human being, you don't have to be a therapist, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, you don't have to be a Bible scholar, but if you're in touch with the love of Jesus enough to be present to that human being and allow yourself to compassionately feel with them. That's how the term is translated, by the way, in 1 Peter 3:8 in many of the translations, to be compassionate. If you allow yourself to feel with them, you begin the healing process. Thompson points out that you literally help that person's traumatized brain to begin to automatically rewire itself, to heal damaged neural pathways. You begin to literally help them out of the cycle of re-traumatization, or feel the feeling that they are constantly being re-traumatized because their brain has been wounded. By simply feeling with them, you help them heal. Are you kidding me? This is unbelievable. He goes on to say, I encouraged Erin, this was his client, to consider how she would describe the feelings she had been experiencing up to that point. She was able to articulate that she felt afraid. Finally, she was able to call out her negative feelings: afraid, sad, and embarrassed. These words represented categorical emotional states that she was previously unable to imagine in words in her mind. So him feeling with her literally freed up her mind to say, okay, now I know what I was feeling. And she called the feelings out. Before, she couldn't do it at all. She was too guarded, too shut down. With no small sense of liberation, Thompson goes on to say, she first admitted her awareness of these physical manifestations of emotion when I asked what she felt now. And he notes, I didn't ask her what she thought. I asked her what she felt. After I had acknowledged her primary emotions, after I had felt with her, Thompson said that Erin said she felt relaxed and relieved. Thompson goes on to talk about exactly what Van der Kolk talked about. He said, this is an example of how we attune to a wounded human being, by simply allowing our hearts to feel with that other person. And I got to say this, I mean, the Bible doesn't often use, obviously, medical terminology of the 21st century. It can't. But it describes experiences that I think medical science is starting to give us technical language to say, wait a minute, that's what I see in the Gospels. When Jesus is with the woman at the well, why did she begin to respond to him? Could it be it's because he paused? He already, as the Son of God, knew her narrative. The text says he had to go through Samaria to get to Galilee, which he really didn't. He could have gone around. He knew there was a woman waiting there for him that was wounded, traumatized, if you will. And instead of coming in with agenda, which is so often what church can be about, we've got, and I'm not against preaching. You know that. I've preached 5,000 sermons, and it's important. Truth is important. But too often we miss that we've got to create space where we can attune to the wounded human beings that are coming into church. And I don't care how dressed up they are. We're all the woman at the well. And Jesus sat with her, and all of a sudden, in a conversation that seems almost rather, mundane, about water and whatever, she starts to relax. She starts to get comfortable with this man that she shouldn't have been that comfortable with because of the protocol of that day in terms of gender. And of course, she'd been very hurt by men as well. And then he was a Jewish man and she was a Samaritan. But she starts to open up. And we put all kinds of spiritual language on that. I think what we're hearing from these scientists is Jesus was feeling with her. And she could sense, even in the mundanity of the conversation, because that's what our right brains, our limbic brains can do. They can feel what others are feeling, even if it's unconscious. We begin to attune to one another. Thompson says your brain is never alone. It's either tuning in, being attuned to, or trying to attune to another brain. That's the way we're wired as human beings in the image of a triune God. And so Jesus, why did the woman begin to open up? Because she started to sense, literally in her brain chemistry, the safety that van der Kolk talked about. And she began to respond, and then was ready to hear the truth that eventually Jesus had to share. I think this is why people respond to Jesus. Initially, it's because of what they felt from him. They felt a love and a compassion that was feeling with their feelings. The Greek word again, sum pathes. Sum meaning with, pathes meaning to feel. Hebrews 4 says we have a high priest who is able to sum pathes, feel with us and our weaknesses. That text is talking about Jesus, the Jesus that was with the woman at the well. The Jesus that feels with us today, you and me, in our wound, in our healing process. Before he teaches us, he feels with us. We begin to heal before the first words come out of his mouth. And it's that feeling with that he is calling us to be about in community, in relationship, as we begin to live out his healing in the world. So, to close, today, individually, what would it be like if today, I don't know if this podcast can have that much impact in your life or not. I don't know. But what if today you said, whoa, I realize that sometimes out of my own uncomfortability with pain, out of my own orientation to my left brain as being everything, truth is everything, that I just want to spout truth. I want to get that person's pain. I want to make it okay. I want to make sure they know what I know. What if today you said, in the name of Jesus, who first felt with people so that they could begin to heal by that attunement that is the way God has made us to heal? What if today you said, Father, through your Son Christ and through the power of the Spirit, would you help me to stop trying to fix people and to be with them and to feel with them in the same way that you, every day of my life, feel with me and heal me like you healed the woman at the well. And what would it look like for you to begin to ask yourself again, as I indicated earlier, where in my life do I have community a Bible study, a recovery group, some close follower of Jesus friends, or maybe some that aren't even followers of Jesus at this point, who simply create safe space for me to be with all of my joys and my deep sorrows and my wounds. They allow themselves to weep with me so that I can begin to heal. From brain chemistry on down, I can begin to heal because that's the way God has wired me. Where do I have that community in my life? Is my church a place where I'm safe? I'm not telling you to leave your church. Maybe you will be a part of the process to help your community become the safe place that even neuroscience is saying we have to have today. Preaching, yes, but we've got to have a way to turn to one another in relationship and feel that safety, that attunement that begins to heal literally our brain chemistry that has been damaged by the wound and the trauma of the enemy. And then maybe the last question, and this is for pastors or church leaders. What is your community like? How can you create space in your community for this kind of scientifically verifiable and also biblically justifiable healing? Where in your community are you creating space in small and even larger groups for this kind of turning to one another so we can attune to one another, so we can feel with one another and let the healing begin? Where are we creating that kind of space? It's a question that you might want to ask yourself and ask the Jesus who is your healer as well. So that's all the time we have today. Hope that was encouraging. I'm going to be on vacation next week, and then I'll do another podcast, and then I'm going to be on vacation the following week. So it'll be a little choppy in August, but I'm back, and we're going to try to keep giving you what we've got, often what we're going through, what I'm going through. I'm going to give you this, and hopefully it's going to draw you closer to your Christ and help you to be Christ to our broken world. Love you so much. God bless you. We'll talk soon.